It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
It's good news for family finances that inflation has fallen below 2%, but of course there's more work to be done to protect working people and bring stability and growth back to the economy.
The rate of inflation falls to 1.7%. So are we still in a cost of living crisis?
Let me be crystal clear about this. We will not be raising taxes on working people. That means we won't be raising income tax, national insurance or VAT.
That was before the election. Today, reports the Chancellor needs to find £40 billion to balance the books. Were we told the truth about tax before we voted? Keir Starmer and his wife at Wembley Stadium in June. Now it emerges the Prime Minister did meet Taylor Swift at a second concert in August. Will Keir Starmer be able to shake off questions about freebies and taxes when he faces Rishi Sunak for Prime Minister's questions? We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, Shadow Education Secretary Damien Hines, author and former Labour advisor Tom Baldwin and journalist and broadcaster Dawn Neeson. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the latest inflation figures, show you how it's being covered. BBC News headline, UK inflation in surprise fall to 1.7%, lowest in 3 years. It's also below the Bank of England's target of 2%. The rate at which prices are increasing has slowed, with some items actually down, like the cost of petrol and diesel. It's down 10% compared to September last year. My opening question is the same as in the headlines. Barry, starting with you. Is this still a cost of living crisis?
I think people are still feeling the pinch, and I think that's the important thing. What we know, and you said it quite correctly, Jo, you said, look, inflation is still going up by 1.7%. So it's not that prices are falling, it's that the rate of inflation is lower than it was. Now, that's a good thing. But I think actually it's got wider implications than just for the family budget. It actually has quite important implications for the national budget. And that's because, people tended to look back at the Liz Truss budget and they said, oh, goodness me, it was all this huge borrowing that she was going to do that frightened the markets. Actually, if you look at it, Boris Johnson borrowed more. So did David Cameron. They borrowed more.
And should a Labour government borrow more?
What was interesting was that they did it at a time when inflation was rising. Was low, and that was fine. It was minus 0.4 and 0.4. But if you look at Liz Truss, inflation was then at 12.4%, and that was the problem with what she did.
Well, we're going to talk about the economy in more depth, particularly on tax. But just broadly, as an opening question, Damien, is this still a cost of living crisis, despite the fact that the rate of inflation has fallen below the Bank of England's target?
Well, look, clearly prices are a lot higher than they were, and people see that when they go shopping, they see it when they go out. But this is good news, and we should welcome the fact we've got low inflation. It's a fall that was greater than was forecast. Actually, the result of a lot of hard work done before July as well. A bit more on that bleak economic inheritance. But it's good news for the Chancellor coming into the budget. It also has an effect on what happens with benefit rise and so on. So as Barry says, there are wider implications. But of course it is good news, and particularly it's good news for the Chancellor coming into the budget.
Does this still mean there is a cost of living crisis, Tom?
A cost of living crisis, I think, there's a strict economic definition about wages exceeding inflation. The real cost of living crisis is what people feel. And I think most people's family budgets still feel like they are in crisis. And whatever Damien says, that's a crisis which really got worse under the last government. I mean, Barry mentioned the Truss budget. That's what spiked inflation up.
So we went to a high of 11%.
Hang on. Inflation spiked in lots of places, and a lot to do with the world energy crisis.
You don't think the Truss budget had anything to do with that?
When Putin decided to invade Ukraine.
Well, it's certain the markets reacted. There's no doubt about it. Inflation did hit 11% for maybe that and other reasons.
I mean, the last government, I think, does get credit for helping clear up some of the mess they made. But inflation's not the only indicator of the state of the economy, and nor is it the only measure of the inheritance the Tories left behind.
Dawn.
Well, it's only a temporary glitch at the moment, isn't it? It's expected to rebound above 2% in October when Ofgem's latest energy price cap increase comes in. So we'll wait and see. And obviously, we are all now waiting with even more bated breath for the budget. The budget from hell, as it's been sort of like sold, isn't it? I mean, we've been warned to expect bad news. It's going to be terrifying. I think everybody out there isn't feeling confident. So a cost of living crisis is very much, as you were saying, Tom, very much we feel like we're still in it, whether the cost of inflation has gone up or not.
Well, you've led us into a discussion about the budget. We've talked of little else because it's not happening until the 30th of October, later this month. Let's have a look at this headline from BBC News. Reeves, that's Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, eyeing £40 billion in tax rises and spending cuts. This is reporting that the Chancellor is looking to find that amount in this month's budget in order to prevent public services from what they say standing still. It also includes what Labour government have said they've inherited from the Conservatives, which is a £22 billion black hole in the finances. Labour have consistently argued that they've discovered things that they didn't previously know about before they entered government. But let's have a look at this tweet from Paul Johnson. He's the chief economist and director at the independent think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He said this during the election: the books are open. Everyone knows exactly the problems a new government will inherit. Barry, was your party during the election being straight with people?
Look, I believe they were, but the point that I would make to you is this. Whatever anybody knew, whether the government knew it or whether the opposition at that stage knew it, what is clear is that the budget for this year alone did not have 21.9 billion in it that was already committed to be spent.
Right, Damien, do you accept that?
There was no way that they knew where it was coming.
I'm happy to go through.
Well, you'll give you a certain amount of time.
Every year, in every department, there are cost pressures. On your first day as a minister, they talk you through, here are all the unfunded cost pressures in this department. And that is true, Barry, as you know, also in aggregates. For the government as a whole at the Treasury. There are also, by the way, always underspends. They never tell you about the underspends because they like to.
But what about the money? But what about the money that was allocated to projects where there wasn't any money?
These are choices that were made, and that is what government is about. It's about deciding what you're going to prioritise and how you're going to fund it, and if you're going to take on extra costs for some things, knowing that either you have to raise more revenue or you're going to have to cut back costs somewhere else. That is not a novel feature
let Barry
for
respond.
This new government. That is how government always operates.
Barry?
Some of those choices were not just choices, though, Damien, they were promises. The 40 hospitals were promised, OK? The funding wasn't there for them. So there are lots of things that people, your government, went out from your government and said, this is what we're going to do. Isn't it wonderful? But actually, they hadn't put the money in the kitty to pay for it. That's the reality of it.
We can talk specifically about the 40 hospitals, if you like. And Barry, you know that government operates on spending review periods and you allocate capital for one spending review at a time. Again, it's not novel to say that you don't allocate capital until you get to the relevant time. But absolutely, this alleged £22 billion is about choices. Yes, there were some things that had pressure that had built up in existing projects, and there were some things which were new decisions.
But they were committed choices.
They weren't all committed choices.
It doesn't help, though, public perception of politics, does it, in terms of trust? How much of that has been eroded by this discussion? What was promised, what's coming down the track, taxes, national insurance rises?
I thought the discussion about tax and spending in the last election was really depressing in what it said about politics, really, in that it's very difficult to have a straight debate about this. Look, the Tories had built in £20 billion worth of public spending cuts. No intention probably of doing it because public services are already cut to the bone, not possible to know where you're going to really get that money out of public services. But it was a sort of clever little tax trap which they hoped Labour would fall into. Labour were probably more honest, I think, in that they were trying to say everything was costed, everything was fully funded. They have discovered worse news since they've opened the books. But there is this sort of some silliness in all this. I mean, at one point I saw on the TV debate, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer being asked to set out their fiscal policy by a show of hands. These are really serious questions. I think it's quite hard to have a serious debate about these choices that Damien talks about because it's all about traps but these are people's lives you're talking about.
Well, Dawn, has Tom got a point? And can the public take the truth? Can we take the honesty that perhaps would have been needed, but then Labour could argue they wouldn't have won the election?
You know what, Jo? I would just like politicians, just for once, gentlemen, just to be completely honest. And, you know, the manifesto, I feel now, wasn't honest, certainly about national insurance. I mean, OK, you could say it was a bit sneaky, we're not touching national insurance, but you are touching national insurance, and that will affect your mythical working people. And what the hell are working people, by the way? Do you mean working class people? If you do mean that, then just say so, because I've got no idea what working people actually means. Mick Jagger is a working person. I just have lost trust in... This isn't even a political point, Jo. And I think a lot of viewers will have as well, just lost trust completely in politicians of all political colours now. The manifesto, at best, was sneaky. At worst, was a lie.
Barry?
No, look, I totally reject that
it
was a lie. Look, let's be clear. The then Chief Secretary for the Treasury, Laura Trott, your colleague Laura Trott, actually said publicly, right, that we had not committed, that Labour, she said, but Labour hasn't committed to saying that they won't raise national insurance on employers. So it was
the best of excuses, really,
it was
Barry,
clearly known. Well, actually, it shows that everybody knew that that was the case.
But it does not show that at all.
Is that a good... Well, hang on. Is that a good enough justification or reason?
Not at all. I'm sorry. I think Labour, what we are, 106 days in, have lost the trust already of the people. And now we have a 40 billion black hole to fill. Where is that money?
Well, not a black hole, but 40 billion pounds that she would like to find, Rachel Reeves.
But where is that money coming from?
Well, that, of course, let's talk about that, because you mentioned national insurance and the pledges made. Let's just remind ourselves about how often Keir Starmer pledged this during the election.
Let me be crystal clear about this. We will not be raising taxes on working people. That means we won't be raising income tax, national insurance or VAT. We will not be increasing income tax, national insurance or VAT, so no tax increases for working people. We will not be increasing the tax on working people, and I'll spell that out. That means no increase in income tax, in national insurance or VAT.
He couldn't be clearer. It will be dishonest if Rachel Reeves increases employers' national insurance contributions.
No, well, look, I don't accept that. It's not happened. But let's talk about the policy, OK? Because I think there's a real problem with the policy if it were to happen, OK? And that is that 17.8% of people who are in employment in this country, working people in this country, actually work for the public sector. So if you were going to raise employer contributions, you would be raising it on pretty much 1 in 5 people who are employed in the hospitals, in the local authorities, in all the public sector jobs. So it would be a huge bill that government would have to find. Now, in my view...
So you think it's a terrible idea?
What I'm saying is that would be a terrible idea. But I think there is a way...
go on.
I think there would be a way of doing this in which it didn't have such a deleterious effect. And that would be if, for example, you said that the higher threshold for the employer only came in if it was a higher taxpayer. And then most of the people employed in the public sector, most working people, would not then feel the implications of it in terms of unemployment or slower rises in wages.
Well, hang on.
Now, can I just say, I have no idea...
No, all right.
I have no idea if Rachel Reeves is going to do anything of this sort. I am not privy to
Well, let's hope she's listening to you while you're speaking now.
What I wanted to do was I wanted to go right back at Dawn and give her an honest view of the policy.
Right.
Because that's what she asked for.
There you go. Are you happy with that honest view of the policy?
No, because, I mean, to be honest with you, listening to you speak is a bit like trying to understand insurance policy. The devil is always in the details, always the terms and conditions.
There's no need
which
to be abusive.
nobody reads.
The small print is
The
what you're
small
talking
print,
about. What do you make, though,
exactly.
Tom, listening to that? Because we've all been talking about what looks likely, we don't know for sure, that it's going to go up employers' national insurance contributions. Barry doesn't like the policy anyway, thinks it is probably, in the way he's outlined it, a jobs tax.
Look, every tax and spending decision you make is going to create some enemies. I think, one of the problems they've got is because of this rather sort of silly, I think, and hysterical debate we had in the election, Labour ruled out increasing income tax, they ruled out increasing VAT, and they ruled out increasing national insurance. So, did they, on working people. Now, they will say they're not breaking that pledge, but they've got very, very limited room for manoeuvre. But money's going to have to come from somewhere because otherwise we're going to have headlines about you've lost our trust on the NHS. You said the NHS. Well, the NHS is going to fall flat on its face unless they find some more money for the NHS. Public services were going to be cut in real terms under the Tory spending plans. You've got to find some money to fill that. So they've got to make some choices. What they're telling me, and I spoke to them about the weekend, is they say, look, we've got to pick a fight. We know there's going to be a fight. We've got to pick the right fight. And we're going to be on the side of working people. We're going to show really clearly that's who we're on the side of. And I think that's the start it's going to take in. They know it's going to be brutal. They know they're going to have accusations of this and accusations of that. They're looking to sort of anchor themselves around being on the side of the right people rather than the wrong people in this country.
Right. Well, who are the wrong people in this case?
I think the wrong people for them are perhaps the wrong phrase. I think the people that they are looking to help and support are probably people without savings, the people who do feel they're in a cost of living crisis, the people who are sort of on their uppers in the last few years. Now, I don't think they're wrong people in that sense, but there are some people who perhaps need support more than others.
Right.
Pensioners, you mean?
Just a thought. Well, pensioners actually are seeing, we're seeing with the inflation figures today that their pensions are going to go up again. Pensions have done pretty well in the last few years.
Right. Interestingly, what Tom says sort of aligns itself with what the IFS have said, Damien, that it's a plague on both your houses. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said during the elections there would be cuts to unprotected departments, big cuts, like Justice, whoever won. So if you were still in government, be honest, Damien, there would be cuts to those departments or tax rises.
Well, first of all, I think Barry makes some very compelling points, and I hope our colleagues
and the answer to my question
in the government are listening. It doesn't change the fact that if national insurance goes up, that is straightforwardly a break with what was in the manifesto.
Working people.
And it is a tax on working people in two ways. Firstly, because in the end, national insurance employer contributions always come out of wages or they result in fewer people being employed. That is straightforward economics.
And the answer to my question.
And well, we're not in government.
No.
They are.
Yeah, but...
We both made sets of commitments at the election. They won with a massive majority. They have responsibilities now in government. And one of those responsibilities is to come good on the document that they were elected on, which is their manifesto. And in their manifesto, they said they weren't putting up national insurance. They said they weren't putting up taxes on working people.
Would you have been able to implement all your unfunded spending promises that were in your manifesto? What cuts would you have made if you were still in government? What taxes would you be putting up now? Look, these are really tough choices.
What cuts?
Look, Tom, listen, I've been in the government party for 14 years. I've been in government for a reasonable amount of time of it myself. And yes, you have to manage the public finances. Sometimes you have to cut back on some programmes. Sometimes you do have to do things.
But what would you have cut?
But you will always, but you will always be held to account. You will be held to account in Parliament.
Yeah.
You'll be held to account by Jo.
Well,
you'll be held to account by the public and at the next election.
What cuts would you have made, though,
We are
Damien?
not currently in government.
No, but what I'm trying
they
to...
Are in government.
No, but I'm getting to honesty.
They have a budget to do. They have a budget to make.
I'm doing that with Barry. What I'm saying is about honesty when you wrote the manifesto in the same way that we are scrutinising whether Labour was straight in there. Oh, no, please don't.
Please don't. So I will answer that straightforwardly. And we did talk in our manifesto about, for example, working age welfare did have to come down. We did say there were economies possible, and it was backed up by the evidence from further reductions in evasion and avoidance. That was backed up by the fact if we got back to pre-COVID levels of that with HMRC, it would have yielded the amount we said in the manifesto. And yes, we had a costed manifesto. Yes, we had a realistic set policies. We didn't get elected.
No,
they did.
we've noticed.
And it's them
All
that
right,
now have to be held to account.
But just before we move on, to pick up on something you said, Barry, you admit and accept that to some extent, although it was a disastrous result for the Conservatives, they did manage to hem you in, Labour government in, on saying, we won't raise this tax, we won't raise this tax, we won't raise this tax, which has hemmed you in.
Absolutely. Look, we were extremely cautious in going towards the election. But, I mean, rather than the debate being about which politician or which political party lied to you more, which is not a very constructive debate.
It's not very edifying.
Exactly, not very edifying. Let's talk about the choices that we've actually got to make and how we raise, if it is 40 billion, how we raise 40 billion. Now, actually, and this is what I was saying about inflation rate coming down to 1.7, that gives much more scope for borrowing than it used to do.
Scope in general, actually, not just borrowing.
No, absolutely right. So there is more scope there to borrow more, but there's also the possibility of raising taxes. Now, you could do that through that national insurance one, but there are others that you could do. Many others that you could do, and I've urged the Chancellor publicly to do them. For example, we levy the lowest rate of tax on the oil and gas development industry in the world, right? If we raised it to the average, that'd be an extra 14 billion a year if that went on in perpetuity. So there are things that it's possible to do.
Well,
tax the polluters, don't tax ordinary working
as I have
people.
said repeatedly, we will be covering the budget, of course, in full on the 30th October with a special programme here on Politics Live. Let's move on and show you this headline. BBC News story, Number 10 denies Swift tickets were thank you to Starmer. This is controversy surrounding Taylor Swift, the singer, being provided with a police escort to and from her concerts at Wembley in August. The story continues, and it's been covered by the BBC's political investigations correspondent Jo Pike. Jo, what did you learn?
Well, two new things, Jo. Firstly, we learned late last night that Keir Starmer and his family did meet Taylor Swift backstage after one of her concerts in the summer. Keir Starmer received in total 10 tickets for 3 concerts over the summer, worth just shy of £8,000, though he's paid a chunk of that back, or about half of that back, because those tickets were received when he was Prime Minister. He's not paid back the ones received when he was leader of the opposition. The second thing we found out yesterday was that Number 10 have basically denied that the tickets Keir Starmer received from Universal Music, which is Taylor Swift's record company, were a thank you for her getting this slightly unusual level of protection on the way to her concerts. We found out last week the cabinet ministers and members of Keir Starmer's staff were involved in discussions over whether Taylor Swift should get this blue light motorbike outrider-esque sort of journey to Wembley Stadium. She did. Now, the government have always said that the Met made the final decision. It's understandable they had a role, but ultimately operational decisions are left with the police. But this does feed into the freebie row that has dogged Keir Starmer for some weeks now.
Well, as you say, some weeks. I mean, Jo, let's just give our guests and viewers a sort of flavour of how this is still going on week after week. The Daily Mail have on the front page here, now Prime Minister is engulfed by Swift furore. The scandal deepens. Taylorgate, they call it. The Guardian here with Keir Starmer and his wife Victoria. Prime Minister met singer, but Number 10 denies tickets were thanks for police escort, similar to the BBC headline. And finally, in The Times, a Swift meeting for Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister and his family were said to have had a 10-minute brush-by meeting with Taylor Swift after receiving free tickets to see her at Wembley. Why is this still a story?
It's still a story, Jo, because I suppose Number 10 haven't said from the start exactly what happened. There are two ways they could have played this. One, almost short-circuit the story, shove all of the information out there as soon as possible and get to the end of the sort of narrative as quickly as possible. They haven't chosen to do that, but presumably one reason is they don't think this is significant, and really the significance of Keir Starmer getting this third set of Taylor Swift tickets, all of those sets were from different organisations, is only really being questioned in the context of the freebie round, which happened after the summer and after all of that. So at the time that Keir Starmer took these third set of tickets, the day after the first concert where Taylor Swift had the police outriders, freebies wasn't a big issue for Downing Street. And I think the view of some in government is that the fact that he met her backstage is not that newsworthy, they might argue. We understand that Keir Starmer and Taylor Swift discussed the Southport attacks, which of course happened initially at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class, and that there was no discussion in that meeting of Taylor Swift's security arrangements.
Jo Pike, thank you very much. Dawn, you are a former tabloid newspaper editor.
Indeed, yes.
Why are they so obsessed with this story, it seems, to Number 10 anyway?
I think some elements of it have gone too far now, Jo. I think sort of like, you know, the fact that Keir Starmer met Taylor Swift backstage, it's a non-story. It's not. The rest of it, however, is, I do agree with that. And I think I agree with Jo. The communications have been handled terribly. If they'd have been honest in the first place, it wouldn't have gone on and on and on like it has. But I think the optics of the whole thing, the whole freebie go, from the glasses to the concerts to the football tickets, are completely wrong when we are facing the budget from hell. And, you know, I didn't think initially this was much of a story, but then, when I read that the Special Escort Group from the Met had said there was no need for Taylor Swift to have a blue light escort into Wembley. That was their decision. So who then persuaded them that it was necessary?
I mean, Dawn has said news management. Do you agree? Is it the fault of Number 10 failing to deal with this properly?
I am a bit surprised how this story has dribbled on for 3-4 weeks when no policy was changed as a result of some gifts of clothes. No public money was involved. No law was broken. And the people who want to draw moral equivalence between this and what happened in the last government, where policy was bent for donors. Downing Street was the most prosecuted workplace in the country during COVID lockdown. Hundreds of millions of pounds of PPE contracts were handed out to mates and cronies. Public money. There is no moral equivalence. And I do think you can just sort of, in communications terms, you do one of two things. You either say, look, this is, as Dawn says, a bit of a non-story. Or you say, well, there is actually a loophole here. There is, a problem with the way gifts are disclosed, and we're going to sort that because we're going to govern differently. My problem with the way it's been handled is they haven't really picked one or the other.
Keir Starmer did say he was going to govern differently. What do you say? There isn't a moral equivalence.
So actually, I just don't think it's appropriate when there's been wrongdoing. And I would say this, and I think I probably did say this possibly on your programme at the time, when there is wrongdoing or there's questions of wrongdoing or there's questions about just behaving in the right way when you're a public servant, to say, oh, well, it's OK because somebody else also did it. I just don't think that's the right...
the same thing.
I just don't think that's the right...
But are you saying that laws have been broken? I
don't know. I do think there are some legitimate questions. There's legitimate questions over the donor stuff and over access to government buildings. There are important points of principle, by the way, about how public money is used, and particularly, actually, even more important than that, this principle of the operational independence of the police. I'm not saying that was questioned or cut across, but those are legitimate questions, and the media play a legitimate role. I think the most surprising thing in all this is we've got Keir Starmer, who's supposed to be this steady hand. We're supposed to have a media operation that really understands and is in touch with what's going on. And they must know how the British press operates. It shouldn't come as a surprise. And yet here we are still talking about it, because they didn't, as Jo said, they didn't just get it all out in the public on day one. That's the way to deal with it, and you close it down.
Tom?
Well, look, as I say, there's two ways of dealing with it, and I think at the moment they've picked neither. I think you have to be careful, Damien, with saying that I'm doing a bit of whataboutery, because there is no equivalence. You say there maybe there was a law broken. We know laws were broken in Downing Street under Boris Johnson. We know that there were hundreds of millions of pounds of PPE contracts handed out. That is fact. And what you're doing is a bit of the sort of Trumpy. Well, some people are saying, maybe there is.
Are you being Trumpy?
First time now in my not that long political career, but I don't have ever been compared to Donald Trump before. That's a bit of an extraordinary suggestion to make.
Right, but your response generally about.
Well, I gave my response already. I just don't think the way to deal with these questions is to say, well, how similar was it to something else? I think the question is, are there are there legitimate questions over, if privileged access is given to, one of our democratic institutions, to a government building, and that is somebody who's been a donor and so on. Being a donor is not in itself a crime, and, our politics relies actually on people who step up and fund it, and that's why we don't have to have state funding. But there are questions with some of these things. They're legitimate to ask. And actually, it is the press, it is the media who has done a lot of that legwork.
The media right to ask questions. But you are sort of implying there's some sort of scandal. I'm not sure what you're saying the scandal is. I haven't come in here and implied anything. I haven't come in here and implied anything. You've implied...
Well, let me imply something to Barry. Here's an idea. In terms of coming out with everything, as has been said by Dawn and Joe Pike, why not come out and be proud of it? Why not say thank you to Lord Ali, our wealthy donor, for kitting us out during the election campaign and afterwards, celebrating the British fashion industry, the same with Taylor Swift and the music industry. There is this feeling of withholding as well as trying to be as virtuous as possible when it comes to being the sort of moral arbiter of these things.
OK, well, and I don't think there's withholding because actually it was declared. And the only reason journalists focused on it was because they late declared the stuff about Keir Starmer's wife. But if I can be a little bit cynical here, if I were organising Number 10's operation on the media, I would think, OK, who's a really popular person in the country at the moment? Not just with young people, but actually pretty widespread. I'd say it's Taylor Swift. And then I'd say, now, how do I associate myself with that popularity for the longest period of time? And I'd let this story run and run and run, because here you have the Prime Minister of the country with Taylor Swift, one of the most popular celebrities in the country. And, it's...
I'm not sure how they're feeling.
A little bit of scepticism over here.
No publicity is bad publicity when it's that sort of publicity.
Gosh, Barry applying for the head of news in the Number 10 operation. Dawn, do you think that's a good strategy?
Yeah. And there are, the Taylor Swift thing. There are questions to be asked, but there are bigger questions to be asked here, because there is no such thing as a free lunch. And readers of your new newspaper, Barry, congratulations, will be asking, what are the donors, what is Lord Ali in particular getting in return? But there has to be a quid pro quo. That question hasn't been answered.
Can I answer that? Because I think, look...
And they weren't completely honest about the penthouse either, by the way.
If it were the case that somebody was getting access and a card to access Downing Street in all areas for being a donor, that would be entirely wrong, OK? If it's the case that this is somebody who is, after all, a legislator, a member of the House of Lords, and a trusted advisor, and in that capacity they were to have one, that would be fine. Now, the issue is that the media have focused on the fact that he was also a major donor rather than the fact that he was a trusted advisor.
I give Tom the final word, but just briefly to take this into account, the ministerial code is not just about a breach of conflict, it's about the perception of there having been a conflict of interest.
I think you do have to get to substance, though, as well. Look, in a different lifetime, when I was a journalist on the Sunday Telegraph, I broke the Bernie Ecclestone story. That was about £1 million donated secretly, no one knew about it, to Labour. They lied about it. That changed policy. That, I think, was a scandal. And as a result of that, you then got you got donations having to be declared, you got the Electoral Commission being established. This is not the same. Wahid Ali has been around for years. We've all known Wahid Ali knocking around the Labour Party for years. He's been giving money to Labour MPs for years. He already had access. The only thing he got as a result of this was the one thing he didn't have, which was a Labour government.
Let's talk about housing, because the government is aiming to build 1.5 million more homes in the next 5 years. Let's have a look, though, at this headline in The Guardian. Government housing targets unrealistic and unfair, warn English councils. Are housing targets achievable, Barry?
Yes, they are, but they need two things. One is they need a reform of the planning laws, and the other is I think they need to make sure that the developers, the way in which they land bank is dealt with.
Right.
Because actually they release land onto the housing market to maximise value, and we need to address that. It's been a problem for years. No government, Conservative or Labour, have ever addressed it properly. Every other country in the world has.
Are housing targets achievable, Damien?
Look, everybody knows we need to build more houses.
Yes, but I'm asking about targets.
I think it's going to be very difficult to hit the targets that the present government has set out, which is not, by the way, to say that they should not be ambitious about it.
Oh.
I think there are important questions about the distribution of it. The fact that targets come down in London seems, I think, to many people, seems very peculiar.
And gone up in your constituency.
Gone up an awful lot in my constituency, and in a lot of other places. The London thing is odd, because obviously there is a lot of demand for housing in London. It is very expensive. It is very difficult to afford. So there's a current consultation, and I hope the government will pay attention to what comes out of that. Perhaps make some changes. I think, by the way, Barry also makes good points about making sure that development does actually come forward once it's been granted.
Well, let's pick up on your point, because the proposed housing target for Brent, which is your constituency, Barry, has been set at just over 2,800 new homes annually. Now, that is down from the current target of nearly 4,000 homes a year. It's a 29% decrease, someone's worked out for me, in the housing target in your area. Are you happy with that change?
Well, yes, I am. Let me tell you why. Because we've actually met our housing targets. We're one of the very few places
Lots of places in London haven't.
No, indeed, but Brent has.
Okay.
Brent has been amazing in delivering on its housing targets, and actually we are getting to the point where the infrastructure will find it difficult to cope if we keep going at that same rate.
But let me
that's really important, and that's why I think the drop is justified.
Right, you think it is justified, but we've just looked at the figures, because the average wait time for a two-bed home is more than a decade. This is social housing, by the way, waiting list in Brent. A decade. For four-bedroom properties, the wait's over 20 years. There are currently 33,000 households on your social housing waiting list. That's 1 in 10 Brent residents. So surely you're disappointed that the government's bringing down your housing target?
No, because, as I say, the infrastructure has to be there able to cope with it, and at the moment it's under strain. So we've met the housing targets, we will meet the new targets, but the point is this also. It's also the type of housing that is being built, because there are applications coming in now for build to rent, not social housing, but build to rent.
But what are you going to say to what are you going to say to those residents? Well, they're not really residents if they haven't got social homes yet. What are you going to say to them?
Well, we've been trying to house them, and that's why we've met our housing targets to date. They were extremely stretching targets, and we met them.
Dawn, what do you make of that?
This is just pie in the sky, isn't it? None of this is going to happen, because we don't have enough planning officers. 84% of councils are saying they have trouble recruiting planning officers, so we are going to push through planning regulations, fine, but there's no planning officers there to do it. We have a shortage of builders and construction workers by 266,000 in this country, and at the rate of the population is growing, we need to build 400,000 houses every single year. We need to start right now. It's not happening.
Well, I mean, these are the figures that Dawn's talking about. Town halls on the Telegraph headline want 10% council tax rights to deliver housing targets, including more planning officers. Is it pie in the sky?
Well, I mean, it's great fun to see the Telegraph finally discovering that local government has been hollowed out and there aren't enough planning officers or anything else in local government now. Look, every politician, every housing minister, every prime minister in recent years has said we need to build more houses. The difference is, I think, is we've now got a government that's actually going to do something about it, and that does cause strains, that does make enemies. It's another tough choice, and it's another trade-off. And Joe, there are going to be screams of pain from people in certain parts of the country. There's going to be people complaining about the green belt. There's probably people in Damien's constituency now getting really worried about it. But if you want to build houses, you've actually got to build them. And you've got to stop consulting, you've got to stop wringing your hands, you've got to stop listening to NIMBYs. At some point, you've got to go ahead and do it.
Right, Damien, do you agree with that? just stop being a NIMBY, not you necessarily.
We're not NIMBYs. By the way, there's no green belt in my constituency. There's a lot of green, but there's no green belt. Green belt is a very specific thing about stopping urban
Are you
sprawl.
embracing the doubling, then, of the new homes?
No. We need more homes to be built in my
constituency.
No, we do need more. But, I mean, Barry talks about infrastructure. You know, in London, infrastructure is one thing. You come out to rural England, it's a different matter. It's a different matter altogether. You do have to keep pace. The points, by the way, about the availability of people to actually build these houses is relevant too. But then you build houses, then you've got to build primary schools, and you've got to build roads, and you've got to build everything else. And so there is going to be a lot of strain. I do think there is some rebalancing needed. You know, you've got an industrial strategy coming as well, which should also be talking about I mean, we called it levelling up. You'll have to rebrand it, but about, you know, moving more economic benefit to other parts of the country. In some places, by the way, where there's been depopulation and where the community would really benefit, actually, from more housing, but coming along with jobs and so on. So I hope they will do some of that and make sure that, but also respect the fact that, you know, in our more rural areas, we need to keep the character of rural areas, and we need to make sure that the provision of infrastructure can keep up.
Right. I mean, it is also about affordability. And, of course, the more homes you build them everywhere, all the time, the figure you gave, 400,000 a year, prices will start to come down eventually.
Well, hopefully, because I think all of us agree that we need more housing. We actually need more housing. We need affordable housing so young people can get their first homes. All of us agree on that. I just want to know, like many of the politicians these days, the devil is in the detail, and I'm not getting the detail. How are you going to do this? You give me the headlines, you give me the headlines from my newspaper, but you're not giving me the details of how it's going to be achieved. Where are we going to find all the construction workers from?
Barry?
We've already had the detail about exactly where those homes need to be.
No, but how? In literally practical terms, who will build them? Who will do the planning once you've bulldozed through the political opposition that you've talked about?
Great question. So that's why we're creating the apprenticeships. That's why we're working with business to try and make sure that the skills base in further education colleges is there to make sure that that supply chain can come through. But the other, of course, answer to your question, Dawn, would be actually these are the reason that many people used to come from Europe, used to come across and supply these trades into the UK. Brexit's put an end to that. And maybe we need to actually attracting people who have those skills into the country as well as training up our own.
We'll leave Brexit for another day, although we do talk about it a lot. Let's just go into the chamber. We can see the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology there, Peter Kyle, at the dispatch box, about 4 minutes away from Prime Minister's questions. Just before we join the Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak in the House of Commons, let's talk about the Tory leadership. Let's show you this. Let's show you this headline in The Independent. Kemi Badenoch, one of the two remaining candidates to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, claims the Tory party could cease to exist if her rival, Robert Jenrick, wins the leadership race. Do you agree with her?
So I think we've got two very good candidates in the leadership. I thought we had 6 very good candidates.
But they've all gone.
I think we've got 2 very good candidates now. Of the 2, I'm going to be backing Kemi Badenoch because I think she has cut through. I think she understands the scale of what we have to do in opposition to build back and then to come back with a compelling proposition for getting into government. I think she understands kind of the breadth of the party and how, you know, there's some people who say, it's all about winning in the centre ground, you have to win back votes, we lost the Lib Dems and Labour. And there's other people who say, you've got to understand, you mustn't, abandon your party base and we've lost all these people to reform. You need to do both. And for us to get back with a compelling proposition, we need to have this broad-based appeal. And I think Kemi Badenoch is the leader to do that.
I mean, we haven't heard from you before in terms of who you were backing as the contest began. What was it that made you finally conclude that she is best placed to replace Rishi Sunak?
Well, all of us have to make decisions. So my vote now is the same as every other party members' votes. But obviously, as members of Parliament and as shadow ministers, as I am, we see people up close. And as I say, I thought we had a whole suite of good candidates. But I think Kemi is the one with the cut through, with the vision, and really understanding the problem and what we need to do to get there.
Well, Robert Jenrick has been speaking this morning about reform of public services. I think we can hear a little bit of that speech. Let's have a look.
We are medicalising normal human experiences. signing off as incapable those for whom work could be a valuable source of support and self-esteem. And they need tougher sanctions for those who refuse to take up suitable jobs. They should be shorter, the claimant review point, for the long-term unemployed, from 18 months to 12 months. So those failing to comply with their conditions can have their benefits removed sooner. If we can get people back into work, we can ensure that taxes are cut.
He's been very clear on a number of policy areas and criticised Kemi Badenoch broadly for being about broad principles but not so much policy. Do you agree with that one?
Well, actually, so there's a lot in that, and clearly some people do have severe mental sickness, and that means they can't be at work. But actually, it is true, and people in the medical world and in the employment world will say this to you, that actually for a lot of people with a mental health condition, coming out of work is like the worst thing that you could possibly do, because of the routine, because of being around other people, the sense of purposeful activity. All of that actually can be really beneficial for your mental health. And we need to, there's a sort of cultural thing where we say, if you're sick, get signed off work. But actually we need to think about it differently. And actually, doctors prescribing people going to work, actually, it can be quite a positive thing.
Barry, do you agree? Just briefly, because we might have to go into PMQs.
When I listened to that, I felt very sad. Because why is it always that people like that pick on the people who are disabled, pick on the people who have mental health problems, pick on the poorest people in our country and say, we need to sanction them, we need to make sure that we get them reviewed much more swiftly. They're not the people who are causing this country problems. The people who are causing this country problems are the people at the other end of the scale. And if you look at the fraud in social welfare, it's minute. And then you look at it in the rest of society and you see who's really raking it in, and it's not the guys that Robert Jenrick was just attacking. I'm sorry, I just found it really sick.
Well, to be fair, look, I've only just seen that for the first time.
You don't support him anyway.
I don't think he was attacking anybody. I think he was making an observation.
How do you think that would feel to somebody who's just come out of a benefits office and had their benefits sanctioned when they're desperate?
We're going into Prime Minister's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alex Salmond was a monumental figure in Scottish and UK politics. He leaves a lasting legacy, and I know that the deepest condolences of the whole House are with Moira, his family, and his loved ones. Mr. Speaker, this week we also remember our colleague and friend, Sir David Amess, whose kindness and commitment to public service continues to inspire us all. And I know how deeply this was felt on the benches opposite, and I'm so glad that his plaque is here in the House with us. I also want to acknowledge the extraordinary life of Holocaust survivor Lily Ebbert, whose message of hope showed such courage. May her memory be a blessing. Mr. Speaker, we also extend our sympathies to the family of General Sir Mike Jackson. He was an inspirational leader of the British Army and served with distinction. Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in wishing the best of luck to the new England manager, Thomas Tuchel. I won't hold his old job against him, but I wish him well in the new one. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Donichend. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In last week's maternity services debate, we heard of the devastating impact of the removal of consultant-led maternity services from a hospital. Now, under the previous government's unfunded new hospital programme, there were proposals to remove consultant-led maternity services from our hospital in Winchester. Could the Prime Minister reassure me and my constituents that under the new government that consultant-led maternity services and A&E services will remain in Winchester, and will he commit to funding properly the backlog of maintenance that has developed in our hospital in Winchester?
Yeah. Well, I thank him for raising this very important issue and for championing the voices of women in his constituency. We are committed to ensuring that all women and babies receive safe, compassionate and personalised care through pregnancy, birth and critical following months. Reconfiguration of the services, as he knows, is a matter for the integrated care boards, important as it allows decisions to be made locally and tailored to local interests. But all changes should be based on evidence, clinically led, and involve engagement with patients to ensure they'll deliver better outcomes. It's a very important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whitby Interactive has provided inclusive play schemes and holiday activities for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities for 26 years. It has been a lifeline for families continually failed by Conservative governments. But Interactive is set to close due to a funding shortfall. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that action to tackle the crisis in SEND provision is urgently needed and that charities like Interactive deserve our support more than ever?
Yes, I do, and I know this will be a concerning time for families who rely on the brilliant work of Whitby Interactive. Children with special educational needs and disabilities have been failed for too long, and this comes up repeatedly in this House, with parents struggling to get their children the support that they need and that they deserve. We must raise the standards for every child so they can succeed in education. We will fix the foundations, Mr. Speaker, and ensure every child can achieve their potential.
Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Can I join with the Prime Minister's words of tribute to Alex Salmond and the Holocaust survivor Lily Ebbert, and thank him for his kind words about Sir David Amess. We remember him fondly, and we will be thinking of all their families at this moment. Mr. Speaker, this week, China has carried out unwarranted, aggressive and intimidatory military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Our allies are rightly concerned. After worrying reports that the government may have intervened to stop a visit to the UK by the former Taiwanese president, can the Prime Minister confirm that the Foreign Secretary will use his meetings in Beijing this week to condemn China's dangerous escalatory acts in the Strait?
I thank him for his question. The continued military activity in the Strait is not conducive to peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits is in all of our interest. On the wider point that he raises, we will cooperate where we can as permanent members of the UN Security Council, issues like net zero, health and trade, compete where we have different interests, but challenge, the point he makes is absolutely right, where it's needed, to protect national security, human rights and our values, and we will put that challenge in.
Well, given what the Prime Minister said, and I agree, of course, we must engage, but we should use that engagement for our national interests. I hope that the Foreign Secretary will unequivocally condemn this military escalation and stand up for democracy in Taiwan. Now, the whole House will be concerned about the fate of the democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai. He is a British citizen who has been wrongly imprisoned in Hong Kong for 4 years. The previous government pressured China for his release. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is a politically motivated prosecution and that it is a breach of China's legal obligations to Hong Kong under the Sino-British Declaration?
Yes, and this case, as he will understand, is a priority for the government. We do call on the Hong Kong authorities to release immediately our British national, and the Foreign Secretary raised this case in his first meeting with China's Foreign Minister, and we will continue to do so.
Rishi Sunak. I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. Now, China, as he knows, has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, supplying the vast majority now of Russia's imported military microelectronics and components, worsening the suffering of the Ukrainian people. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he is prepared to sanction any Chinese business or individual involved in aiding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including secondary sanctions on financial institutions?
Yes, and we've called for that in the past. We continue to do so, and I hope this is an issue where we can have unity across the House.
Rishi Sunak.
Yes, I can assure the Prime Minister of his support. It is something that we began. The United States recently have expanded their sanctions, and I hope that the new government will continue to look at doing the same. Now, the last government also established a new system of registration and monitoring to protect the UK from interference from foreign states, including China, Russia and Iran. Called the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, it was described as essential by MI5 in the fight to help keep Britain safe. But since the Prime Minister took office, he has halted its implementation. Why?
That isn't correct.
Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, that is very clearly what the government has said. And only last week he said at the dispatch box that he would give the security forces the powers they need. And if he is going to fulfil that promise, I would urge him to get up to speed on this issue and therefore implement the scheme. Furthermore, Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee have warned that British universities are increasingly a rich feeding ground for China to exert political influence over us. That's why we passed the Freedom of Speech Act with new powers to help defend universities from this threat, but the new Education Secretary has since blocked it. So can the Prime Minister tell us how, without this tool, the government will prevent Chinese influence over our universities?
I really don't think party political points on security and intelligence. Throughout the last Parliament, we stood with the government on all questions of security and intelligence because it was important to the outside world that we did so. I worked with the security and intelligence services for 5 years prosecuting cases. I know firsthand the work that they do as a lawyer. I've known firsthand the work they do as the Prime Minister. We support them in everything that we do, and he knows that.
Mr. Speaker, whether it's the FIRS scheme or the Freedom of Speech Act, these were new tools, new sets of powers that the previous government passed in order to give, whether it's our universities or security services, the powers they need to tackle a growing threat. And we will, of course, continue to support the government in protecting our national security, but do believe on this side of the House that those tools are needed and are concerned by reports that the new government has paused their implementation or indeed scrapped them. But finally, Mr. Speaker, the Chinese government has sanctioned multiple members of our parliament for championing human rights. As a result, they have faced intimidation, abuse and surveillance. And Mr. Speaker, I commend you for your defence of the right of every member of this House to speak out on crucial issues without fear of retaliation from foreign states. Now, I know the Prime Minister will agree with that too. So this week, will the Foreign Secretary in his meetings not just raise the issue, but tell the Chinese government to lift those sanctions on our colleagues?
Yes, and we speak with one voice. He speaks about the record of the last government. That record was 14 years of failure. 6 years austerity, 3 years of Brexit logjam, then Johnson Trust and the Leader of the Opposition, utter failure. And this government was elected to do things differently, to make fairer choices, but most importantly, to give Britain its future back. So we will fix the foundations. We'll do it with a long-term plan to grow our economy, protect working people, and rebuild our country.
Jane Craft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, Thurrock Council was led into effective bankruptcy by the then Conservative administration, in no small part due to an investment of hundreds of millions of pounds into a solar farm scheme run by a con man. Given the Prime Minister's commitment to integrity in public life, will he support mine and my constituents' calls for a public inquiry so that those responsible can finally be held to account?
I thank her for her question because years of underfunding have left councils facing huge budget pressures. They yawn, they don't know the impact it has on working people up and down the country. They rely on public services, and what's happened in Thurrock is shocking. We are committed to resetting the relationship and helping those under intervention to recover and to reform. 14 years is a long time to destroy local services, and it's clear it'll take time to fix them. We will get councils back on their feet by providing multi-year funding settlements. But ultimately, we have to grow our economy, and I'm surprised the Prime Minister didn't welcome the £63 billion of investment that we were able to announce on Monday.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the tributes of the Prime Minister to Alex Salmond, to Sir David Amess and to Lily Ebbott? And can I welcome the news that ministers are going to review the carers allowance repayment scandal after campaigns by carers organisations, the Guardian newspaper and the Liberal Democrats, culminating in our motion on the order paper today. But will he agree with me that the evidence needed for the review is already long established and many of the decisions self-evident? So will he and his colleagues vote for our motion today so we can write off the overpayments, we can end the crazy cliff edge to the earnings limit now and have a fuller review for the support that carers deserve?
I thank him for raising this. This is obviously a really important issue affecting a number of people. And that's why we've launched an independent review into the carers allowance overpayments to look at the circumstances of the overpayments, to see what went wrong and therefore what can be done to put it right, because carers must get the support that they deserve. So I'm grateful for him for raising it. I'm glad that we've been able to take this action today to go forward on a really important issue.
David.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for that answer and ask him that ministers in the review will listen to the voices of carers throughout. Can I turn to the Middle East now? Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich had said that starving 2 million people in Gaza might be justified and moral. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir called settlers who killed a 19-year-old on the West Bank heroes. After my visit to Israel and Palestine last February, having witnessed the damage that these extremist ministers in the Netanyahu government are doing, I called on the last government to sanction them. The last government refused, but we now learn that the former Foreign Secretary was considering this. So will the Prime Minister now sanction Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich?
We are looking at that because they're obviously abhorrent comments, as he rightly says, along with other really concerning activity in the West Bank, but also across the region. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. The death toll has surpassed 42,000, and access to basic services is becoming much harder. And Israel must take all possible steps to avoid civilian casualties, to allow aid into Gaza in much greater volume, and provide the UN and humanitarian partners the ability to operate effectively. Mr. Speaker, along with France, the UK will convene an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to address this.
Lyndon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been an honour to meet my constituent, Tom Morton, a young person in care who sat in the public gallery today and cares so deeply about politics and communities. Young people in care are at a disproportionate risk of criminal and cynical exploitation by drug barons through county lines. Will the Prime Minister tell Tom and the House what steps the government will take to prevent vulnerable children in care becoming involved in county line operations?
Well, can I welcome Tom to this House? It's encouraging to see young people engaging in democracy. County lines is a real problem, and all of us will have experienced the effect and impact of that in our constituencies. And our County Lines programme focuses on preventing young people being exploited and lured into criminal gangs, which is far too common, and committed to introduce a new offence of child criminal exploitation, long overdue. We will also create a network of young future hubs, staffed with professional youth workers, mental health support workers and career advisors, to provide focused support for young people, helping them to fulfil their ambitions and preventing them being drawn into crime.
Savile Roberts.
Iawn, Lefarydd, and Plaid Cymru too would like to pay tribute to Alex Salmond and Sir David Amess. Mr. Speaker, 1 in 5 people in Wales is on an NHS waiting list. The Secretary of State for Wales says that a new cross-border NHS plan would bring down Welsh surgery waiting lists. But the First Minister of Wales, Labour, contradicts her. She denies it has anything to do with bringing down waiting lists. Are they making it up as they go along?
The difference is this: we now have a Westminster government that wants to work with the Welsh government to deliver for the people of Wales. For 14 long years, the Welsh government was in a position where the then government was in conflict with them. So now we will work together, collaborate, and ensure that together we deliver across Wales.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, join me in praising our Labour Police and Crime Commissioner for Cleveland, Matt Tory, who's working with me to tackle knife crime, drug crime and antisocial behaviour in Stockton North, and assure my constituents that under this Labour government we'll see more police officers in Stockton and Billingham.
Well, I welcome his work with the new Labour Police and Crime Commissioner. And it's sad to say that in Cleveland, full-time equivalent police officers fell by over 12% under the last government. When you fail on the economy and growth, those are the types of things that happen across the country. As part of our neighbourhood policing guarantee, we'll put 13,000 more neighbourhood police and PCSOs back on our streets and ensure every community has a named local officer. Through our Safer Streets mission, we will tackle illegal drugs, half-knife crime and crack down on antisocial behaviour and go after the gangs that lure young people into violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As evidenced by some earlier questions, issues surrounding SEND, local government finance and adult social care are issues which affect all of our constituents. And let's be honest, Mr. Speaker, for too long, both parties have ducked and dodged taking the difficult but necessary decisions. In order to give certainty to our constituents and confidence to those who provide those vital services, does the Prime Minister share my assessment that there is considerable merit in formal cross-party working on these issues, where we can share taking those difficult decisions in order to improve outcomes for our constituents?
Well, I am grateful to him for raising this question about SEND, because it is a really important issue, and I think this is the fourth time in two Prime Minister's questions where it's been raised on both sides of the House. I quibble with his suggestion it's both parties, since his party was in power for 14 years. But the spirit in which he puts this forward, that this should be cross-party, is something that we should take up, because it's such an important issue. It affects so many children and parents, and therefore, notwithstanding the quibble, I'm very happy to work across the House on an issue as important as this.
Katrina Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Fairways Networking Group, a group of small businesses in my constituency of Cumbernauld and Kirkintilloch, all operate on tight margins. Can my right honourable friend help me reassure this group that not only do they have nothing to fear from the Employment Rights Bill, but they have plenty to gain as exemplar employers?
Yes, the Employment Rights Bill is pro-worker and pro-growth, and proudly so. And I don't believe you can build a strong economy by having people in insecure work. The party opposite, they go against every protection for workers. They're against the minimum wage, they're against these new protections. But the vast majority of businesses, large and small, already know that investing in your human capital, treating people properly at work, is what produces growth. So here's the big political divide. They always oppose workers' rights. We will always champion them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate the Green Party with his tributes to Alex Salmond and Sir David Amess? 99.7% of new patients in the east of England are unable to find an NHS dentist, the worst affected area in the country. My constituents in Waveney Valley want urgent action. So when will the government begin the critical negotiations on dental contract reform so no one in the 21st century has to pull out their own teeth? And will it be by the end of this year?
Well, he raises a really important issue because dentistry was left in a shocking state by the last government. I was shocked to hear that for children's hospitals, the commonest cause for admission for 6 to 10-year-olds in our children's hospitals in this country is to have teeth taken out because of the failure of the last government. That is shocking on any analysis. We will put that right, we will take the necessary steps, and we'll work across the House to do this as quickly as possible.
Dan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night in this House, we took the first steps in abolishing the hereditary principle of privilege. I was hosting the Let's End Poverty Coalition at a meeting upstairs where we heard that often for many who experience poverty, that feels hereditary too. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and those with lived experience of poverty to find ways in which we can hear from those with that lived experience to break that cycle of poverty?
She makes a good point. The party opposite, they want to get rid of maternity pay, but keep hereditary peers. It's the same old Tories. But, you know, the letters, this is an important issue that she's raised. The letters are honest, powerful and important. And I think they hold up a mirror to our country. We will deliver a budget that drives economic growth, improves the lives of working people, fixes our public services and rebuilds our country with a decade of national renewal.
Diolch Llefarydd. My constituent Jeanette Crawford suffers from ME and chronic pain. The cold, damp conditions of a Welsh winter are going to mean a lot more muscle soreness and fatigue for her. She's lost her winter fuel payments due to having a very small savings pot. With 86% of pensioners in poverty or just above that line to miss out in Wales, will the Prime Minister establish a social energy tariff to help people like Jeanette?
On this issue of winter fuel payments, we have inherited a £22 billion black card. They should be apologising, not groaning, for leaving the country in such a state. We are committed to the triple lock. The point about pensions is really important, and that means that the triple lock means that the pension will increase again by £460 next year, which means that pensioners under Labour will be better off because we're going to stabilise the economy after that lot lost control of it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Britain, the biggest killer of men under 50 is suicide. We have some of the worst paternity leave in Europe, and boys are 50% less likely than girls to pursue higher education. I know that my right honourable friend takes this very seriously, and his commitment on reducing suicide rates is very welcome. Can the Prime Minister update the House on this work, and does he agree with me that it is vital that we tackle these issues head-on because of the increasing alienation and mental health issues amongst young men?
I thank him for raising this vital issue. The statistics on male suicide are truly shocking. I went to an event just a few years ago here in this place where everyone in attendance was asked if they had lost someone to suicide, and I then reflected on my own experience, which was profound. As it was, I could see for everybody across the room, and will be across this House. So reducing deaths from suicide is a vital part of our health mission. We're recruiting an additional 8,500 mental health workers, specially trained to support people at risk of suicide, to provide faster treatment and ease pressure on our services.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Group Captain Lizzie Nichol had an exemplary career with the RAF until she was forced to resign for refusing to implement illegal recruitment orders. Despite inquiry after inquiry vindicating Lizzie, on every count the RAF and MOD have failed to offer her fair compensation, and those responsible have walked away. Shamefully, during the Purdah election period, in what I believe was an attempt to subvert ministerial oversight, she was offered a derisory £2,000 by officials. I have documents proving beyond doubt that the former Chief of the Air Staff lied to the then Defence Secretary about her case. The Prime Minister says he believes in righting wrongs, so will he meet with Lizzie and help ensure that those responsible do not just walk away and that Lizzie gets the justice that she so very much deserves?
I thank her for raising what is obviously a very important case, and she's right to do so. I'm not across the individual details of it, but it obviously does need to be looked into. So we will commit to look into it, and I will make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to lay out such details as she has and to get some answers as to our inquiries.
Jake Richards.
Mr. Speaker, children's social care in this country is now in crisis. Vulnerable children are regularly placed hundreds of miles from home, often in unregulated and unsafe accommodation. Meanwhile, private companies are making record profits on the backs of struggling and desperate local authorities. Frankly, this is an issue, a national scandal, that doesn't get enough attention. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'll be presenting my private member's bill, which will offer modest reform in this area. But will the Prime Minister reassure me and thousands of families across the country that it is a priority of his government to fix the social care crisis and our family courts?
Well, I thank him for raising this issue and being a champion on it. He is absolutely right about the appalling inheritance. 1 in 4 children in absolute poverty. That's a terrible inheritance. And too many vulnerable children in unregulated accommodation. Through our Children's Wellbeing Bill, we will put children and their wellbeing at the heart of education and social care systems. We'll also provide a home for all young care leavers to ensure that they're not homeless and remove the barriers to opportunity so every child can thrive in safe and loving homes.
Mr. Speaker, during the election campaign, the now Prime Minister made a hell of a lot of promises, some of which I'm sure he will remember. Of particular importance to my constituents in Andover, North West Hampshire, was a promise made on the 18th of June during a campaign visit to Basingstoke, when he made an unequivocal, unconditional commitment to rebuild our local hospital. Mr. Speaker, is this a promise on which we can rely?
Mr. Speaker, firstly, I'm grateful to him for raising this because it's obviously of huge importance to his constituents and his right to do so. We are reviewing, as he knows, the programme. The programme that the last government put in place for 40 new hospitals had a number of flaws. They weren't all hospitals, they weren't new, and they weren't funded, so we're reviewing it. But what I will... No, but he's right to raise this, and I will make sure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss the particular development in his constituency. It will matter to his constituents who are listening to this, and it's important they know where the failure lay.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's historic investment in carbon capture and storage technology for Teesside and Merseyside. This week I've been at the sector's conference, and the feeling there is that this is a government delivering after years of delay. Will the Prime Minister recognise the unique potential that Teesside has for jobs, prosperity and economic growth into the future?
Yes, and Mr. Speaker, you will have observed that on Monday we had a very successful investment summit, £63 billion coming into this country, jobs in every part of the UK, and a very clear message from business that they were prepared to invest now under this new Labour government. Part of that was £22 billion commitment to CCUS, creating the first clusters in the world, including, as he points out, in the various parts of the country. So we'll support these jobs, we'll support these investment, we will grow our economy and rebuild our country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Cornwall is an amazing place to live and work, but a top-down approach from Westminster has failed us. Public services are chronically underfunded, young people forced to move away to pursue careers elsewhere, and affordable housing is a promise that's simply never kept. Will the Prime Minister meet with all 6 Cornish MPs to discuss devolution for Cornwall, with a Cornish Assembly that recognises our unique culture, language and national minority status, so we can finally unleash Cornwall's economic potential?
I'm grateful to member for raising this. I do believe in transferring power out of Westminster and into the hands of leaders who know their communities best. Those with skin in the game know what's best for their communities. We are already making steps in the South West by signing the devolution agreement for Devon and Torbay. I absolutely encourage local authorities to work with their neighbours to pursue deeper and wider devolution for their area, and I'll make sure that he has the meeting that he's asking for.
Final question, Blair McDougall.
As the Prime Minister works for a ceasefire and the return of the hostages, he'll have the support of people across this House. The Prime Minister will have noted the comments from the White House calling for urgent action to deal with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and for the Netanyahu government to increase access to aid and to the amount of aid getting through. I wonder, does the Prime Minister agree with the comments from the White House and can he tell us what representations he is making on this matter?
Yes, I do agree with those remarks, and we are constantly making representations on this with our partners. There is an urgent need, and has been now for a very long time, for more aid to get into Gaza. It's a desperate situation, and Israel must comply with its international humanitarian law obligations, and that is why we are convening a session of the UK Security, of the UN Security Council with others to address this issue.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's question.
That is the end of this week's Prime Minister's questions there. For this part of Politics Live, let's introduce our guests who have joined us. Jo Stevens, Welsh Secretary in the Government, Andrew Griffith, Shadow Secretary of State for Science and Technology for the Conservatives, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. Well, it was very much dominated in terms of the exchanges between Rishi Sunak, the leader of the opposition, asking questions about foreign policy, particularly the government's approach towards China. But perhaps the most interesting response from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, came answering questions from Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, on Israel and the treatment and sanctioning of two ministers who are seen as right-wing and extreme in Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Ed Davey asked whether the government was looking at sanctioning them, and the Prime Minister said yes. They are looking at sanctioning the two ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, for fuelling violence in the occupied territories in the West Bank, and also for justifying the action that's been taken in Gaza. Vicki, what did you make of that?
Yeah, well, this has, as a story, been raised this week because the former Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, revealed that he had been looking at sanctions. And Whitehall sources say that those sanctions were ready to go. Now, I think the feeling is, and the understanding is, that it was put on hold during the election campaign in order to not inflame tensions anymore in some communities. It's also understood that the US were against this. So there's a big question here about the UK's actions and whether they act with others, and that is the feeling. So David Lammy, back in September at the Labour conference, suggested he was talking to partners about this. You know, it's not that usual for the UK to act on its own. They feel that obviously it's much more impact if you're doing it alongside your other allies, whether that is America or the European Union, the rest of the G7. So that seems to be where we are. But interesting there that Sir Keir Starmer said that they are still looking at all of this. And of course, it goes along with other action that's been taken. According to some Labour MPs, not enough action has been taken against Israel. But of course, they have restricted some arms sales. So they would say they have done a certain amount. But it'll be interesting to see now how quickly and whether they can get agreement with others to go forward with these sanctions against these two ministers.
Well, it sounds like it could well happen, this action to sanction these two particular ministers. What sort of timeline do you think we'd be talking about, Jo?
Well, I think Vicky's absolutely right. You know, we would want to look at it in the context of what our allies are doing as well, and, you know, to make the correct decision. And I'm not going to put any pressure in terms of timescales on the Foreign Secretary. That's not my job to do. But clearly there are discussions ongoing, and a decision will be made at the appropriate time.
Andrew Griffith, would you support that measure?
Well, I think it's very dangerous when the UK takes performative individual decisions.
You think it's performative?
So we're at our best working with allies such as the US, who have real leverage in this situation. It was wrong, I think, it was premature to go back and restore funding to UNRWA, and it subsequently revealed that they were heavily involved in some of the terrorism activity. And we saw on arms sales, again, quite a lot of backlash and some briefing that the US didn't support that. So we're at our best when, as Jo said, we work with allies and we don't take unilateral action in these spaces.
What do you say in response to that? There was criticism from the United States and Joe Biden about the government's decision to limit a number of arms sales licences to Israel. Do you now agree with Andrew Griffith?
I don't agree because that decision is made on the basis of legal advice, and we are required to comply with the law. That's what this government has done.
Right. Legal advice. You took that decision, the previous Conservative government, that is, not to do that, not to follow what Jo Stevens says was legal advice.
Look, views differ as to what's legal advice. That's the government's position, that is this legal advice, they had no choice. That's not our position. This is a decision ultimately taken by ministers, and they are politically accountable.
But do you accept that you are required to comply with international law?
And that, of course, and that did move unilaterally versus actions that the US take. Now, look, we're in a difficult position with the US elections coming up. The US, I think many commentators observe, is not playing its always traditional role of upholding Israel as one of the functioning democracies, but also being willing to be a critical friend and sometimes a restraining.
Well, but let's just show you. Let's just show you this headline from today.
The thing that would make this worse is UK unilateralism in this space. It's a difficult time. It's a difficult time in the world.
With international
it's a difficult time. Well, I've answered that question, Jo.
Well, you haven't. No, you haven't.
No,
and clearly, when you were in government, you didn't comply with it, did you?
Well, I've answered the question that the UK government should comply with international law.
Right.
Neither Jo nor I are privy to the briefings that we've seen. If you want to publish the Attorney General's advice, I'd be very happy to look at that, Jo.
Well,
that's very convenient. So I'd be very happy if you want to publish. If you're very keen about doing that, then publish the. No, you're absolutely able to.
Publish their legal advice.
You should know that, Andrew. The Attorney General's advice. That's something that is a decision that you could make right now.
Right. You talked about the UK acting unilaterally, but this headline, today's headline in BBC News, the US gives Israel 30 days to boost Gaza aid or risk cut to military support. This is to allow more aid to get into Gaza, particularly in the north, where the casualties are extremely high under Israeli bombardment. You said that you don't know the timeline. That's fair enough. You're not the Foreign Secretary. But do you see the urgency now that the UK could step up its actions as well as its rhetoric in terms of trying to put pressure on Israel at this moment in its military conflicts in both Gaza and in southern Lebanon?
We've been working very hard, the Foreign Secretary has been working very hard since we came into government just 100 or so days ago with our allies to try to stop the tensions in the Middle East, stop the regional escalation. That involves, we've been very clear, we want to see a huge surge of aid going in, we want hostages released, we want to see a two-state solution at the end of a strong political process. Yeah. And that is our aim, and that is what we are doing, working with everybody in the region who we can work with our allies to achieve.
I mean, there's already been political pressure from within the Labour Party and a number of MPs who now sit as independents. There is this early day motion that has been put forward by Richard Bergen, UN's resolution on Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and sanctions. It has these very firm suggestions for the government to take on board, to cease importing products originating from Israeli settlements that will be in the occupied territories of the West Bank. Is that something the government should now consider?
We've been very clear about occupation, illegal occupation and compliance with international law. This ultimately comes down to all countries, whoever they are, complying with international law. We know there are illegal settlements. We know there is illegal violence in those settlements, and we have been clear about we want to see that stop.
Right. I mean, so it wouldn't be unilateral. Would you support that toughening of the line by the government here in order to try and put more pressure on the Israeli government?
Well, I'm not sure it is about the government toughening the line. This is internal Labour Party politics. The party's riven and split.
So you want to see a stop to the violence in the West Bank?
Well, I've been very clear. It's not about. Of course, one wants to see a stop to the violence. Good. The question is about how one does that. And is it better for the UK to act in a performative way, often unilaterally, not with allies, or is it better that at this difficult time, the democratic world, and particularly us and our US allies, but also the European Union, act together in concert? Now, that's my critique of the government, and pressure within Jo's party is for them to manage.
All right, well, let's move on and talk about the situation of the NHS in Wales. There was a question during Prime Minister's questions from Liz Saville-Roberts, who heads up Plaid Cymru in Westminster. Her question was 1 in 5 people in Wales are on an NHS waiting list. The Secretary of State for Wales said that a new cross-border NHS plan would bring down Welsh surgery waiting list. But the First Minister of Wales, who's Labour, contradicts her. She denies it has anything to do with bringing down waiting lists. Are they making it up as they go along? Jo Stevens, conveniently we have the Secretary of State for Wales just with us.
I think Plaid Cymru are trying to perpetuate the squabbling relationship that the previous Conservative government had with the Welsh Labour government. At our conference in Liverpool, I announced a new partnership approach with Welsh Government, which involves 3 strands. Firstly, best practice being learnt from the Welsh NHS. The example is dental contracts, where we've reformed them, unlocking 400,000, nearly 400,000 new appointments. We'll take help from England, from the English NHS, in terms of unlocking those extra appointments every week in the NHS.
And will this bring down surgery waiting lists?
The third point was mutual aid partnerships between England and Wales, identifying capacity so that we can use that capacity to bring down waiting lists for elective surgery. We were very clear about what those 3 strands were, and I think that the peddling of misinformation about it, primarily led by Plaid Cymru, just shows that they don't want to protect patients in Wales.
Well, never mind
They're
Plaid
not
Cymru.
interested in bringing down waiting lists. All they want to do is continue the squabbling attitude of the previous
actually, with all due respect, Jo Stevens, it sounds like the First Minister of Wales, the Labour First Minister of Wales, is wanting to perpetuate some sort of division. She's contradicted you completely. She says it hasn't got anything to do with bringing down waiting lists. There isn't the capacity.
No, that's not what she said. That's not what she said. I saw exactly what she said in FMQs yesterday, and that is not what she said.
Frankly, there's not much capacity in England either. So which bit isn't the case?
So this is about identifying where there is capacity. It may be at certain points in time.
She says there isn't much.
There may not be.
So she's wrong.
There may not be capacity at certain points in time. There may be capacity at other points in time. This is about... The public would expect us to work together so that if there is capacity, we are utilising it to bring down waiting lists. That's what we're going to do. It's common sense. The previous government had 14 years to do this. They didn't do it.
Right, but there is a difference. I mean, if Eleanor Morgan is standing up and saying, frankly, there isn't much capacity in England either, this is about best practice, is what she's saying, then Liz Saville-Roberts has a point. Who is telling the truth here? What is it actually about?
I've just explained what it's about. I told you exactly the 3 strands of the announcement, about the 2 elements of best practice that we're sharing, and about working together to identify capacity, and where there is capacity, we will utilise it.
Right, so it is about bringing down waiting lists, or isn't it?
It is about bringing down waiting lists. We were elected on a manifesto...
So Eleanor Morgan's wrong.
No, we were elected on a manifesto in Wales and across the UK to work to bring down waiting lists, to make the NHS fit for the future. That's why we've announced this new partnership. That's why we are determined to bring down waiting lists, and we will do it in a common sense way, which is what the public want and expect.
After you leave the studio, will you be getting in touch with the Labour First Minister to remind her then about what this is all about? This cross-border plan is about bringing down waiting lists.
The difference between now and under the previous government is that I talk to the First Minister almost daily. We are working in close partnership to deliver the benefits that 2 Labour governments can bring for the whole of the United Kingdom, but particularly in Wales.
Well, she made these comments yesterday. Have you spoken to her since then?
I speak to the First Minister pretty much every day.
Right, so since she made those comments about this?
I speak to her pretty much every day. I'm not going to go into details about when and exactly, at what time I speak to the First Minister, but I speak to her virtually every day.
I mean, the thing is, are they making it up as they go along? And you can see clearly from Jo's answer, although accept that Jo's trying in good faith, that that's exactly what's happening. Labour health waiting lists have, for a long, long time, been worse than those in England. Health services across the Western world are under stress, but the reality is that the numbers show that Labour have presided over a more difficult situation for the NHS in Wales. So it's a very sensible idea, actually, to be using some cross-border capacity. Many people in Wales live closer to an English hospital or English healthcare facilities. It's a perfectly sensible idea. I'm glad that that's now happening. But Labour have presided over a crisis in healthcare in Wales for a very long time.
And Vicki, it's such a good idea. Why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it 14 years ago?
I didn't interrupt you, Jo.
Well, no, you had finished. I mean, that is a good question. Why didn't you do it if you thought it was such a good idea?
Well, because we were blocked by Labour in Wales. The Labour government in Wales that's presided over this crisis all of a sudden now. And remember, the Lord Darcy's report didn't even cover, that the report into the state of the NHS didn't even cover, conveniently, the state of the NHS in Wales. Why would that be? Why would that be, Jo?
Because, as you know...
And what do you think that would show?
It's devolved. Health has devolved to Welsh Government and the Welsh Senedd.
Nothing to stop Lord Darcy reporting on the state of the NHS in Wales.
And so
I'm sure
you
you'd
had
like,
14
I'm sure
hang on.
I'm sure you would like to know. Yeah, you can't just
to do
keep saying
something about
14
it.
years.
And
you've got to...
I can, and I just did.
You've got to move. When you're in government now, you've got the opportunity to actually solve these problems and to really step up on your colleagues in Wales.
Read my announcement.
I mean, broadly speaking, of course, this is also about the state of public services, about investment, all the discussions that we've been having ahead of the budget that is coming on October the 30th in a few weeks' time, and conversations about whether Rachel Reeves will borrow more for investment. And broadly speaking, there is a lot of focus now on promises made during the election and promises that may or may not be broken in the budget, Vicki.
Yeah, and I think what we're noticing really with the government, not that far into this parliament, is that they're quite boxed in. Now, partly that's because of the things they themselves have chosen to do. And I think it's proving to be a bit of a problem. You've ended up with fiscal rules, which they adopted, which they're now, obviously, it sounds like very likely to tweak, to change. You've then got promises that have been made about specific taxes, even things like the pensioners' triple lock, all these things that were said during the election, for reasons which, of course, people can understand politically, that parties don't feel, maybe, that they can be completely honest about what they might plan to do. Now, that is a big discussion about trust and about general election campaigns, and you can't help but feel you go through a 6-week election campaign, and you know as a journalist, you're asking the question, you're not getting the answers, and you know that there will be things that come down the line, but politicians don't feel that they can be honest with the electorate. So I think we're in this position now where we didn't exactly know what Labour were going to do. There was the commitment about the 3 main taxes not going up, but now we're talking about the possibility of national insurance contributions for employers, that they might go up, and a row about whether that has broken the manifesto commitment. But you get a sense of a Chancellor slightly scrabbling around to try and find tax rises in order to fill these black holes that she's been talking about.
Well, to underline exactly what you have been saying, Vicki, let's have a look at a letter that was sent by Rachel Reeves, who is now the Chancellor. This letter was sent to a viewer of ours who has sent it into the programme because of promises that he, Brian, felt were made by Labour, and now he wants the government to uphold it. If we have a look at the key bit that he has highlighted, it says, I want taxes on working people to be lower, not higher. I will not increase rates of income tax, national insurance or VAT. He said to us that he is in no doubt whatsoever that all national insurance rates were included in that Labour promise. To be credible, the government first has to be open and honest in its promises and assurances. He doesn't think the Chancellor's being honest.
Well, I disagree with Brian. We were very clear in our manifesto. We were explicit in it, in which we said we would not raise taxes on working people, income tax, national insurance and VAT. We were very clear about that, and we will keep to that promise. And Vicki makes the point about honesty. We have come into government to do politics in a different way, to be honest with the public, and we are being honest about the problems we have inherited from the previous government. We're being honest about what we need to do to fill that enormous black hole of £22 billion, and we are being honest in that we will stick to the promises in our manifesto.
Do you think a single person believes that that sentence doesn't imply that you will hold rates of all national insurance flat?
We said we will not raise taxes on working people.
You said you would not raise,
we will
you
not
said you
raise
would not raise tax on national insurance.
working people.
It's pretty
on
clear.
Working people.
It's pretty clear what it says.
Is a small business owner a working person?
They're a small business owner. They employ others. We have said on working people we will not raise taxes on working people. But, I take issue with Andrew.
Not a tax on workers.
I take issue with what you're saying.
Well, let her respond.
You were part of a government that put the highest tax burden on this country in 70 years. You backed Liz Truss to be the Prime Minister of this country. You said, I was reading an article that you wrote, in which you said that Liz Truss was the best person to lead you to victory in the general election. So I'm not going to take any lessons from you on judgment about...
Well, I think I should take some lessons from me on grammar and substance of what you write, because that is a very, very clear sentence that anybody who reading it would understand that you have no plans to raise income tax and national insurance.
On
That's just a question on the grammatical structure of a sentence. National insurance is only on working people. It's a tax that is related to people's employment when they work. That's all it does. It doesn't tax capital when you sell something.
You are getting to the point where you feel that the Chancellor is looking for wriggle room. Now, I would say, looking at that, there is still wriggle room in that. It's talking about the rate of national insurance. One of the proposals is possibly that employers might have to just pay on the pension contributions. That's not the rate. But, you know, all of this sounds as if, again, as I say, the Chancellor is slightly scrabbling around to find things that don't go, of course, against what was said.
Well, they're trying to fiddle the debt rules so that you can spend money outside of the historically accepted fiscal rules. If you do that in a private company, you go to prison. But apparently the Chancellor thinks that she can add to the nation's debt. All of the plans on things like VAT on private education turn out not to add up. It turns out to cost more money. The same thing with the winter.
Let's just return.
The Chancellor is out of her debt.
Well, let's just return to what Vicki was saying about the rates. Could it happen, Jo, that it isn't the rates that go up, but the scope of national insurance, in the way that Vicki Young said that actually they could charge tax for the first time on the pension contributions to staff?
The budget will be on the 30th of October. The announcements will be made on the 30th of October. There's not long for people to wait to hear. We're not going to make announcements in advance of the budget.
No, not announcements.
What I'm saying... made an announcement about corporation tax.
But hang on.
You did make that announcement. That announcement was made on Monday.
We said in our manifesto that we would not raise the rate of corporation
raise national insurance in
Yes, but as I say, might it be... Jo, you've been pretty equivocal that... unequivocal that they will not raise the rates of national insurance. So they could, Rachel Reeves could do something about the scope.
I'm not going to talk about what's going to be in the budget. You know, the budget will be delivered on the 30th of October. So there can be all hosts of speculation about various measures. The budget will be on the 30th of October. The Chancellor will set out the measures that she is taking.
All right, well, let's have a sort of talk about the substance, if you like, as to whether it's a good idea to increase national insurance contributions at all, or certainly on employers. Let's listen to Rachel Reeves speaking in the Commons in 2021.
What is decided in this place has huge implications for businesses, from the kitchen table start-up to our high streets, to industrial parks and to commercial giants known across the world. That is one of the reasons why it is so worrying that at this crucial time, the Prime Minister and Chancellor concocted a new jobs tax to arrive in the spring. Despite all of their election promises to cut national insurance contributions, they're actually raising them against the strong advice of business and trades unions.
So Rachel Reeves there did think that increasing national insurance contributions in any way would be a tax on jobs and bad for businesses. You agree with that, Jo?
I'm not sure that's what I took from what she said there.
What did you take? What did you take from that?
I took from that she was saying that a promise was made by the last government, which they reneged on.
Right.
That's what she said in that.
But I think, well, with all due respect, I think what most people would take from that is that she thinks that's a bad idea if they reneged on it, the last government, because it would be a tax on jobs and bad for businesses. Otherwise, she'd have supported them reneging on it.
We have got to get out of this doom loop that we've been left in after the last 14 years. You know, this is why we were elected on a manifesto to bring economic stability, to fix the foundations and to deliver economic growth. And that's why this week, on Monday, we had £63 billion of private investment pledged into the UK to create 38,000 new jobs. That's the record that we'll stand on. That's what we've done. Yesterday, there was another announcement about £550 million investment on housing. You know, we are going to make sure that we get the investment through government, through the industrial strategy, through the National Wealth Fund and the private investment to grow the economy. If we do that, we increase revenues into the Treasury, we can invest in our public services.
I mean, Andrew, we can see the pressure on the finances. Labour said they've inherited an economic black hole and some. We've been seeing them for quite some time, as we have long discussed on this programme. Is it credible for the Conservative Party to oppose all tax rises?
Look, the only loop that's going on is the loop inside Jo's head and her other colleagues.
No, but Andrew, answer that question.
Talking and looking backwards. There's a big issue about trust in politics, and there will be a huge issue if Labour, having come in and not talked about what their plan to take away the winter fuel allowance, having come in and led everybody to the clear impression they wouldn't be touching national insurance, come in and turn around.
All right.
And on
So
the back of a manufactured set
will you oppose all tax rises?
On the back of a manufactured black hole, having Rachel Reeves in opposition in the election campaign said she had a fully funded plan, fully costed. The OBR had put out the figures. Then we came up with the 22 billion. This week we're being briefed out it's 40 billion. I mean, it's just not credible. It's not credible. She's out of control.
And this is why the public don't
Of course you can balance the nation's books. We came forward to tackle one of the biggest challenges in public finances, which is the expanding welfare bill. Our plans would have taken 12 billion out of that welfare bill. That would have helped balance the books. Rachel Reeves hasn't got any plans to reform
hang on. The Institute for Fiscal Studies were very clear. It was a plague on both your houses. And certainly if you had won the election as Conservatives, you would have had to have cut spending in those unprotected departments and or increased taxes.
It's not unreasonable. Look, I was a finance director for 12 years. It's not unreasonable for governments to make choices and sometimes to spend less in particular areas through reform, like things like welfare.
That's all we have time for today. I'll be back with more of this on Politics Live at 12:15 tomorrow. Bye-bye.